Right now, you are the only human species on the entire planet. That feels normal to you, obvious even, like it could never have been any other way. But for most of human history, that wasn't true. For hundreds of thousands of years, Earth had multiple human species living on it at the same time, different kinds of us walking the same rivers, hunting the same herds, sometimes crossing paths in the same valleys. And then, one by one, they disappeared, all of them, except us. So the question isn't really what happened to them. The real question is scarier than that. Why them and not you? Let's start with just how crowded the world used to be. At various points, Earth was home to Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, the Denisovans, and us, Homo sapiens, all existing at overlapping points in time. Some of these species survived for over 1 million years, far longer than we've been around so far. Homo erectus alone lasted close to 2 million years, spreading from Africa into Asia, surviving ice ages, surviving climate shifts that would terrify us today. These weren't primitive failures waiting to be replaced. They were successful, adaptable, and in some cases tougher than we were. Think about what that actually means for a moment. 2 million years is almost 20 times longer than Homo sapiens has even existed as a species. If you measured success purely in terms of longevity, Homo erectus would beat us by an enormous margin, and they haven't even finished their story yet in the sense that their legacy runs straight through several of the species that came after them. This wasn't some failed evolutionary experiment. This was a template that worked generation after generation across a huge stretch of the ancient world. Take the Neanderthals. For a long time, popular imagination painted them as slow, dumb, hunched-over brutes. That picture is almost entirely wrong. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, sometimes larger. They made sophisticated tools, they controlled fire, they buried their dead, and in at least a few sites, arranged flowers or objects around the bodies. They hunted enormous, dangerous animals at close range, which meant they were not just intelligent, they were physically formidable. Their bodies were built for cold, thick, powerful, compact, an entire skeleton engineered for European Ice Age winters. If you put a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens next to each other in a fight for survival, on paper, the Neanderthal wins. And it wasn't just physical strength. Neanderthals show evidence of caring for injured and elderly members of their group, individuals who had broken bones heal, who had lost teeth, who clearly could not have survived on their own for extended stretches of time. Someone was feeding them, someone was protecting them. That's not brute instinct, that's social structure, that's compassion in a form we recognize in ourselves. Whatever else separated us from them, it wasn't some enormous gulf in basic humanity. And yet Neanderthals are gone, and we're not. So what happened? The honest answer is that there isn't one single cause. There's a pile of them, stacking on top of each other over tens of thousands of years, and each one made the next one harder to survive. Let's go through them. The first pressure was climate. The Ice Age wasn't one long, stable freeze. It was a series of brutal swings, extreme cold snaps followed by rapid warming over and over. Neanderthal populations were never huge to begin with, likely never more than a few tens of thousands of individuals spread across the whole of Europe and parts of Asia at any one time. A small population is fragile. When the climate lurched hard enough, food sources collapsed, territories shifted, and small isolated groups didn't have the numbers to bounce back. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, had spent tens of thousands of years surviving in Africa's varied and unstable environments, savannas, forests, droughts, floods. We weren't tougher physically, but we were more used to unpredictability. That difference matters more than people think. There's a concept here worth sitting with: genetic diversity. A larger, more spread-out population carries more variation within it, more different versions of the same genes, more raw material for adapting when conditions change. A small, isolated population has less of that cushion. Every generation, a small group is rolling the dice with fewer numbers on the table. Over tens of thousands of years, across dozens of climate swings, that statistical disadvantage compounds. It doesn't guarantee failure in any single generation, but stretched across enough time, the odds start working against you in a way that's almost impossible to reverse. The second pressure was competition, direct competition over the same resources. When Homo sapiens began moving into Europe and Asia around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, they weren't walking into empty land. Neanderthals were already there, and had been for hundreds of thousands of years. For a while, both species occupied overlapping territory, hunting the same mammoths, the same reindeer, gathering from the same limited stretches of edible plants during hard seasons. Two species competing for the same finite food supply in the same shrinking habitable regions during a climate that kept punishing everyone. Something had to give, and this is where a quieter advantage starts to matter more than muscle or brain size, numbers and networks. Homo sapiens groups, even early ones, appear to have maintained wider social networks. Evidence from ancient sites shows sapiens trading materials across huge distances. Obsidian shells, ornaments moved hundreds of kilometers between groups that had never met face to face. That tells us something important. Sapiens weren't just isolated bands fighting for survival alone. They were connected to other bands, exchanging resources, exchanging mates, exchanging information. If one group had a bad season, they had somewhere to turn. Neanderthal groups, as far as the evidence shows, were smaller, more isolated, and far less interconnected. When things got hard, they had fewer places to fall back on. This networking advantage shows up in more than just trade goods. It shows up in something harder to measure but just as important, the spread of ideas. When you're connected to dozens of other groups across a wide territory, an improvement made in one valley, a better way to nap a blade, a smarter trap design, a new technique for tanning hide, can travel outward and spread through an entire population within a few generations. A useful idea invented by an isolated Neanderthal group might die with that group if it never gets the chance to spread. Homo sapiens, by staying loosely connected across huge distances, effectively built a shared library of knowledge that kept growing even when any single group struggled or vanished. Then there's the question of diet and flexibility. Neanderthals were heavily reliant on large game, especially in colder regions where plant food was scarce for much of the year. That's a high-risk, high-reward strategy. Big animals give you huge amounts of food and fat when a hunt succeeds, but they're dangerous, unpredictable, and their populations crash hard when the climate turns against them. Homo sapiens diets, by comparison, look more flexible across excavated sites, big game when available, but also fish, shellfish, small game, a wider range of plants. A generalist can survive a bad year for large animals by shifting to something else. A specialist can't. When you're locked into one food strategy and that strategy fails, there's no plan B. This flexibility extended into tool design as well. Homo sapiens sites from this period show a wider range of specialized tools, fishing implements, snares for small game, tools designed for processing plant fiber into cordage and nets. Each of these represents a different way to pull calories out of a difficult landscape. When the mammoths were scarce, there was still the river. When the river froze solid, there were still roots and tubers buried under the snow. Every additional food source was another lifeline, and having more lifelines meant a group was harder to starve out completely. Disease may have played a role too. When two populations that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years come back into contact, they carry different immune histories, different pathogens their bodies have never had to fight before. We know Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. We carry the evidence in our DNA right now. Most non-African populations today carry somewhere between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA. That means these two species weren't just competing from a distance, they were close enough, often enough, to have children together. And anytime two populations mix that closely after a long separation, disease exchange becomes a very real possibility, one that could have hit a smaller, more fragile Neanderthal population especially hard. There's a grim pattern in later human history that offers a useful comparison here, even though it happened tens of thousands of years later under very different circumstances. When populations that had been isolated from each other for long stretches of time came into sudden contact, disease often did more damage than any weapon or any direct competition for resources ever could. We have no direct proof this same dynamic played out between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, Neanderthal population, but the biological logic behind it is climate and shrinking territory would have been especially vulnerable to any new pathogen entering their world. And this brings up something people often get wrong. Neanderthals didn't simply vanish. In a very real sense, they were absorbed. Small numbers of Neanderthals interbred with incoming Homo sapiens populations again and again over thousands of years until the last pure Neanderthal lineages thinned out and disappeared as distinct populations, while fragments of them live on scattered through our genome. You, right now, might be carrying pieces of a Neanderthal ancestor inside your own cells. Extinction, in this case, wasn't a clean ending. It was a slow blending followed by a disappearance. It's worth pointing out that this Neanderthal DNA isn't just a historical curiosity sitting quietly in our genome doing nothing. Researchers have connected certain Neanderthal-derived genes to modern immune responses, to skin and hair traits, and even to how some people's bodies process fat and cold exposure, traits that would have been useful for surviving in Ice Age Europe. In a strange way, some of what let Neanderthals survive brutal winters for hundreds of thousands of years is still riding along inside a portion of the human population today, quietly doing its job. Homo Floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species, found on the island of Flores in Indonesia, tells a different version of the same story. Isolated on a small island for a very long time, they evolved into a smaller form, well adapted to their specific environment, surviving until surprisingly recently, possibly overlapping with modern humans arriving in the region. Their world was small and contained, and once outside pressure and competition arrived, that same isolation that had protected them for so long became the thing that made them vulnerable. They had nowhere else to go. Island isolation is a strange kind of trap. For tens of thousands of years, being cut off from the mainland protected Homo floresiensis from larger predators, from competing human species, from the same climate volatility hitting the continents. Their small size itself was likely an adaptation to limited island resources, a phenomenon seen again and again in island-dwelling species across the animal kingdom. But an island only has so much room and so much food. There was no reserve population somewhere else to fall back on, no wider network to draw from. When change finally arrived on their shores, there was no second chance waiting on the other side of a mountain range. There was only ocean. Homo naledi, discovered deep in a South African cave system, remains one of the strangest pieces of this puzzle. A small-brained, primitive-looking species that may have deliberately placed its dead in that cave, a behavior we associate with far more advanced cognition. We still don't fully understand their story, or exactly when or why they disappeared. Some pieces of this history are still buried, literally. What makes Homo naledi so unsettling to researchers is the mismatch between brain size and behavior. By most measures, a brain that small shouldn't be capable of the kind of deliberate, repeated, ritual-like activity the cave evidence suggests. It forces an uncomfortable question, one that applies to every species in this story. How much of what makes something recognizably human has less to do with brain size and more to do with behavior, with care for the dead, with cooperation, with the simple act of choosing to do something the hard way because it mattered? If Homo naledi really was doing this, then the line separating them from us gets a lot blurrier than a simple measurement of skull volume would suggest. The Denisovans deserve their own mention here too, if only because they show just how much of this story we still don't fully know. We don't even have a proper skeleton for them, just a handful of bone fragments and teeth, and yet their DNA lives on prominently in some populations today, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania, where certain groups carry Denisovan genes linked to high-altitude survival. An entire human species spread across a huge stretch of Asia for tens of thousands of years, and we've reconstructed most of what we know about them not from their bones, but from the genetic echoes left behind in the people descended from them. It's a reminder that extinction in the human story rarely means total erasure. It usually means dissolving into something else. So pull all of this together and a pattern starts to emerge. It's not that Homo sapiens were smarter in some obvious, overwhelming way. It's not that we were stronger, we clearly weren't, not compared to Neanderthals. What we had was a set of
More
small
flexible
advantages
diets,
that, on their
slightly
own,
larger,
wouldn't have
more
meant much,
resilient
but
populations,
stacked together
a track
again and
record of
again,
adapting to
generation
chaos
after
rather than
generation,
stability,
tip the entire outcome.
None
None
of
of these things guarantee
wider
survival on
social
any
networks.
single day, but played out over tens of thousands of years, across dozens of climate swings, they add up to the difference between a species that persists and one that fades out. There's also a harder truth buried in here, one that's easy to miss. We didn't just outlast the other human species. In some places, we very likely competed them into extinction, directly and indirectly, whether through violence, through outcompeting them for shrinking resources, or simply by being the more networked, more adaptable species standing in the same shrinking space. Being the last human species standing isn't necessarily a story of triumph. It might just as easily be a story of surviving something that others didn't, at their expense. It's tempting to tell this story as a straight line, an inevitable march toward the version of humanity that sits here today. But nothing about it was inevitable. At several points in the last few 100,000 years, the numbers could easily have broken the other way. A slightly harsher climate cycle, a slightly smaller Homo sapiens population leaving Africa, a handful of bad seasons at the wrong moment, and the species writing this story right now might have been a different one entirely, or none of them might have made it at all. We tend to look backward and see a clean narrative, but the people actually living through it had no idea how any of it would end. They were simply trying to get through the next winter, so here's the picture. At least 6 human species walked this earth in overlapping windows of time. Some of them were bigger, stronger, better adapted to their environment than we were, and one by one, climate pressure, food collapse, disease, isolation, and simple bad luck wore each of them down until only one was left standing. Not because that one species was destined to win, because that species happened to be flexible enough, connected enough, and lucky enough to survive 100,000 years of extinction events that ended everyone else. And that species is you. Every person alive today descends from the survivors of that filtering process, generation after generation of ancestors who happen to be in the right place, with the right social network, with the right adaptable diet, at the right moment in a collapsing world. You're not just the product of evolution in some abstract sense. You are, quite literally, what's left after every other version of being human got tested by the same planet and didn't make it through. The others aren't gone because they failed to be human enough. They're gone because survival was never guaranteed for any of us. It just happened to work out, this one time, for the species that became you. And maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not a triumphant one, but an honest one. Somewhere out there, in a cave system we haven't found yet, or buried under ice that hasn't melted yet, there are probably still pieces of this puzzle waiting to be uncovered. More species, more evidence, more reasons why some lines of the human story continued and others quietly ran out. Every discovery adds another name to a very long list of relatives who almost made it all the way to now and didn't. You are the answer to a question none of them got to ask. Why us? It wasn't destiny, it was survival, one narrow margin at a time carried forward by every ancestor who simply refused to stop.